Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I have the one and only Rick Perlstein. Rick is a writer, journalist, and historian who has written 4 marvelous books on the social and political conservative waves during the 1960s and 70s. Those 4 books are Before the Storm, Barry Goldwater and the Unmaking of the American Consensus, Nixon Land, The Rise of a President and the Fracturing of America, The Invisible Bridge, The Fall of Nixon and the Rise of Reagan, and Reagan Land, America's Right Turn, 1976 to 1980. In this episode, we talk about all 4 of those books. It was quite the task to try and condense all of that in an hour, and I feel like the conversation does a really nice job of trying to get at many of the major themes that Rick details in his books, and I would encourage everybody to pick up all 4 of them. They're fantastic to read, and definitely lots to learn from all of those books. We start the conversation by discussing his motivations for writing these 4 books and a little bit of how he did it. They're very large. I think there's a total of 3,500 pages across all 4 books. We talk about the first one and the rise of Barry Goldwater and the splintering of the New Deal coalition from FDR. We talk about the shifting cultural voting bloc from a very robust middle class to becoming some sort of elites, and then how Nixon's rise and reign worked with those social cultural changes during the 60s. We talked about suburbanization and how that was an influence and a push towards Goldwater, and then definitely with Nixon, and then that brand of kind of modern day conservatism. We talk about the ever-present role of Ronald Reagan as kind of always looming in the background, never front and center during the 60s and 70s, and then the second half of the 70s in his run for president, and then becoming president in 1980. We talk about the conservative shift from economic to more social cultural elements. We talk about Reagan Democrats and that phenomenon, and especially in the Midwest, and some of the building of the current conservative coalition. And then we talk about the Conservative Party over the past 40 years, so since 1980 when Reagan was elected, and how that leads up to current day conservatism and the Republican Party. And, we talk a little bit about Trump and kind of now post-Trump and the future of the Republican Party and conservatism in general and what that might look like. I have to say this was such a blast. Rick is a really, really nice person. And he has a really nice way of just talking about these themes and explaining it. And I had such a great time talking with him. And so now I bring you Rick Perlstein. I'm here with the one and only Rick Perlstein. Rick, thank you so very much for coming on the podcast. I greatly appreciate it.
Pleasure to meet you.
Okay, so I will have introduced you in the intro and everything, so we can get right into the nitty gritty here. You have written 4 incredible books. I guess my first question is, how the hell did you do that? And what was your inspiration and motivation to doing that?
This story has kind of evolved, as I've told it, 50,000 times.
Sure.
I've been working on this stuff since 1997. That's when I started it.
Yeah.
So, kind of 24 years and, 3,500 pages later, the story has come to begin when I was ridiculously young, when I became fascinated by watching televangelists on Sunday mornings when I was a little kid. And that's as far back as I can trace it now. But I think that was kind of betokened an early fascination with this, how Americans kind of can be anthropologists of each other, right? And how there was this kind of completely foreign culture, foreign to my, kind of upper middle class, kind of Jewish suburban background. And just kind of gawking at these guys, faith healers, super Southern, and just the whole aesthetic of it, I think was kind of riveting to me. I think the next part of the story is kind of having pretty conservative parents, small business owners, who my dad would always talk about the regulators, getting all up in his grill and, resenting him for his success. And, my mom always wondering why there were homeless people when there were so many want ads in the paper. And my parents were, in the world they grew up in, the world, their kind of social world was kind of pretty Zionist, and I was kind of very skeptical of that. So that was certainly a political discussion I used to have. I think that's where I kind of learned about a certain kind of style of kind of tribalism that, I kind of associate with right-wing politics, even though, it wasn't necessarily a right-wing identity, right? And they wouldn't have necessarily called themselves conservatives or Republicans. And then finally, I became obsessed with the 1960s. And that's the part of the story I've been kind of telling the longest. Growing up in the 80s and being aware of this time in which kind of revolutions happened like every month. And the melodrama of it, and the violence and the passion and the music, and, when this has almost kind of become like, a trope in Perlsteinology, is that when I got my driver's license, I would go to this used bookstore, the Renaissance bookstore in Milwaukee. That was like 5 stories, completely like, one step ahead of the building inspector. And the whole basement was just piles and piles of old magazines. And I can literally like tell you about magazine articles that I read, down in the basement there. And, picking up books, by Black Panthers that spelled America with a KKK. And then I think this is where it gets a little bit interesting, where the two kind of the fascination with kind of people who think differently than me ideologically, because I'm already kind of developing a liberal political identity, and the fascination with the 60s kind of come together into an interesting synthesis. I also was picking up all these books written in the 60s that, for example, were arguing that the Beatles were a communist plot, right? So kind of John Birch Society stuff. Yeah. And I think I developed an appreciation as a post-baby boomer that the 60s really wasn't just about this sort of social movement, kind of story, but that it was really kind of a more of a American Civil War story. That there were kind of two ways of looking at the world that came together in, just cataclysmic ways. And, kind of fast forward, basically, when I eventually, went to college, went to graduate school, went to New York to be a journalist, and then kind of started thinking about wanting to write my first history book. I kind of came upon almost like as a market niche, the fact that no one had really written about the rise of the right in the 1960s, and the fact that these were the guys who actually kind of, to a certain extent, although this is interesting discussion to have, won the 60s. So that came together in late 1996 with a book proposal about the Barry Goldwater movement and campaign. So I was off and running, and kind of conceived it all the way from the beginning as kind of a series of books culminating in Reagan's election.
So that was from the beginning, kind of the general arc of it.
Yeah, 3 books metastasizing into 4. Luckily, through the editorial administrations of those close to me, never made it to 5 or 6 or 7.
Yeah, they did get progressively longer, which I don't mind, but it was very interesting.
Yeah,
how they
my
got
publisher
bigger.
wasn't always thrilled. There was actually a very interesting, intense moment in which there was a discussion of publishing it as a 2-volume set.
Oh, wow.
In a slip box, which was kind of fun to think about for a little while.
Well, so
they actually they were discussions with the production department. They kind of literally kind of figured out how they could physically manufacture the book. Which, I really appreciate Simon & Schuster's faith and trust, and that they were
for sure
willing to let the bet ride, put it all in.
Well, I guess there has to be some purpose for starting with Goldwater in that campaign,
right?
Which I'm sure you can talk about. I'll just share briefly that one time I was working in DC, and I work in mental health and stuff, and I had this kind of old supervisor, and I said, what happened with, Republicans used to be this party of, Teddy Roosevelt and Eisenhower and these are some of the bigger known folks that are conservative, but, and then it just went to Nixon and Reagan and, everything else. And what happened? And, his answer was always, oh, it was definitely Nixon. That was the big turning point. And he said there was things beforehand, and I never really thought. And then I, years later, I saw Before the Storm, and then I said, oh yeah, I remember this conversation. Yeah, and then and then I started reading the story
on Reagan's platform.
Yeah.
36 years before, and got his ass handed to him. Yeah, I was aware of who Barry Goldwater was because I had grandparents who had a house, condo, I guess, in Arizona.
Ah, okay.
Names all over there. And my dad, we would pass by. Oh, there was Barry Goldwater's house, which is a gorgeous house, And my dad would always say, in your heart, he's right, but in your guts, he's nuts. And I was like, what the hell is he talking about? So it's kind of like there in the back of my head.
Sure.
But what I kind of came to appreciate was kind of the standard narrative of the right that the right told, which I later began to question, but it was very much kind of like there was really no conservative movement before National Review kind of came along and kind of announced it, which we can talk about why that's not quite the way I see it now, but certainly at the time when I was beginning this work, the idea that there's this kind of modern conservative movement and it's kind of political, it plants its political flag with the Barry Goldwater campaign. And coming to appreciate, just with some cursory secondary reading, that there were all kinds of tributaries that, fed into the movement. And it really was a movement that led to this guy becoming a presidential candidate. From the kind of southern part to the southwestern libertarian part to the midwestern conservative part to the young people, to the kind of conspiratorial right of the John Birch Society. And that, one of the fascinating things about studying successful politicians, and in his way, he's obviously successful,
sure,
is that they always are kind of figures that coalesce in terms of coalitions. Right? And that everyone kind of sees in this figure their own beau ideal, even though they are all different. A successful politician is able to kind of pull together lots of different strands. So seeing these tributaries, and once you have a bunch of tributaries leading to, a kind of, a mighty raging river, right? To continue the metaphor, then you have a story on your hands.
Yeah.
And that there was a story to be told that had really never been told in kind of a comprehensive way. In the same way that, for example, I had been reading Taylor Branch's books about Martin Luther King,
right,
which is really kind of a role model for what I was trying to do with these books. So Goldwater, and then obviously the Goldwater movement brings in Reagan, has a Nixon component, has an Eisenhower component. And it turns out to be this wonderful, luckily I was fortunate in stumbling into the right subject, way of telling all sorts of American stories and also 60s stories.
Yeah,
rumbling on from there.
Yeah, I guess there's two parts I have to the Goldwater piece, which you're sort of highlighting here, which is for a long time you had the New Deal coalition, which I think started to sort of splinter in the 60s, and kind of what you're saying, Goldwater, kind of maximized on that and started building coalition is how I understood it based on the book and other things. And so what do you think happened for the New Deal coalition to splinter in that way? Because it was very strong. I mean, sure, it had its critics, but you had the all the way to 29, Depression, World War II, et cetera, FDR, and then how did that not stay?
I mean, the House, the Democrats control the House from 1933 until 1994.
Right.
Until 1980, they controlled the Senate, except for 2 years, right? And Eisenhower, of course, is a guy who basically accepts large parts of the New Deal, which is really what starts the story in motion, was the disgust with that. I mean, it's important to remember that, Goldwater loses really, really badly, right? So say, oh, well, this idea that the New Deal is over, this conservative, this hegemonic conservative notion that there's this kind of massive secret, kind of mass of conservatives that are just waiting for a candidate to vote for. Well, that's wrong. It turns out America's a liberal country, and this New Deal coalition is going to go on forever. When it really starts kind of breaking down in a serious way is in the next book, and which starts with the Watts riot. So a huge part of the breakdown of, roughly speaking, this, kind of elite notion held by kind of media elites that this is basically the American quote unquote liberal consensus. The same people, basically begin to question it. And of course, also at the grassroots, you can basically see the fissures, going back to the New Deal.
Yeah.
I mean, just to give one example, there's a classic book in history called The Origins of the Urban Crisis by a guy named Tom Segru. And he locates the kind of stuff we associate with, George Wallace and Nixon and Ronald Reagan and the backlash in Detroit in the 1940s. Right? So there's always, what Vladimir Ilyich Lenin called combined and uneven development. But really, when it really starts reaching critical mass is, first of all, a bunch of factors. One is, the outbreak of urban violence, right? And the extension of the civil rights movement into the North and massive backlash against that in the North, right? So in Nixon Land, which is the second book, the most important section to me is the failure of the first civil rights bill in 3 years in 1966. Its centerpiece is basically it outlaws discrimination in selling and renting housing. And it, for decades, almost really since the Civil War, the South has literally been trolling the North, saying, you think you're so much better than us. You're passing all these laws, this terrible colonial reconstruction, these civil rights laws telling us who we can serve and Voting Rights Act that only affect us. But once your axe is going to be gored, you'll realize the whole country thinks like we do. And, one of the details I keep on going back to these days in the wake of Trump is a line that a Texas delegate at the Goldwater Convention in 1964 says after Goldwater wins his nomination. He tells a reporter, "We just moved the Mason-Dixon line up to Canada." Right. So this idea that basically it's a certain kind of Southernization of American politics that begins taking shape in the late 1960s. Other important aspects of it, race obviously is very important in the 1960s. The idea that the anti-war movement, is, just so massively disruptive. So people are basically becoming more reactionary around that. Certainly that's a huge part of what Reagan and Nixon were up to. And then kind of to fast forward into more my third and fourth book, Invisible Bridge, and then Reagan Land, is the kind of collapse of the Keynesian economic consensus. So just a huge part of what made the whole thing work was what historians call kind of post-scarcity economics. The idea that America is the most first middle-class society built by the New Deal, and that it's just going to keep on getting richer and richer and richer. And I just came across a really interesting example of that, just how strongly the politics of kind of 60s liberalism and radicalism were rooted in this post-scarcity notion. I mean, when it comes to radicalism, the idea that hippies had that you could basically just live off the fat of the land and that you didn't have to work that much, it's just based on the idea that there was a lot of fat of the land to live off of. Right. For radicals, the idea that you could create a Marxist revolution in America, is based on the idea of that scarcity has been conquered. Really, I mean, that's kind of almost like a Marxist dialectic idea, And then even among kind of liberals, taking on kind of something like the Great Society or even Vietnam, which Johnson dreamed of it as basically he said we're gonna create a TVA in the Mekong River Delta, the idea that, sort of America could do anything
Yeah.
was based on this profound economic confidence. So here's a really great example I just stumbled across because I'm teaching this class on social change.
Mm-hmm.
I was reading something called the Freedom Budget. Are you familiar with that?
Mm-mm.
It was written by a guy named Barry Goldwater, who was the guy who organized the March on Washington in 1963. And it was published in 1967. And it was kind of presented as a way to stop all these terrible urban uprisings.
Mm.
And it was endorsed by Martin Luther King. And it really was kind of the agenda that Martin Luther King was fighting for when he died, when he had this idea of a poor people's movement that was going to swamp the Capitol Mall with protesters until this thing was passed. And it was basically, basically was the idea of a guaranteed jobs for everyone, to put it roughly. But if you look at how the thing was written, it was very politically shrewd in that Bayard Rustin said, America is such a dynamic and growing economy. The average tax bill for every American is $500. We're growing so fast, soon it's going to be $700. Let's take that extra $200 and use it to, build schools, build hospitals, provide jobs, and just in the Keynesian model, that will just increase our prosperity even more.
Okay.
Of course, by the 1970s, all that productivity is stagnating. Right,
Yeah.
You're getting stagflation, and it becomes very hard to kind of tell a story in the way that liberals were telling the story, with that strut just knocked out. And that's a big part of Reagan's appeal to the electorate in 1980. I talk about one of the supply side economics guys, Jude Winniski, called the two Santa Claus theory. That it used to be that no one voted against the Democrats because no one shoots Santa Claus. The Democrats were giving you jobs. The Democrats were giving you Social Security. And first of all, with this economic ordeal, the Democrats were turning against that. Carter was very big on balancing the budget, for example. And here comes these supply side economics people embraced by Reagan saying, now we're Santa Claus, we're going to give you a tax cut and it's going to solve all these problems.
Yeah.
So, basically the New Deal consensus, all the struts are kind of knocked away by historical developments, right?
So it's the violence in the United States, some of the race relations, definitely Vietnam, and then in the
social
early 70s.
Revolutions.
Yeah.
They really, by the 70s, one of the plots of Reagan Land is how, things like gay rights and feminism are really just kind of beginning to work their way into the mainstream. And it seems like a glide path, right?
Yeah.
And no one appreciates, again, these fissures that were always there beneath the surface. And, smart, shrewd political organizers, both elected officials and activists, are seeing opportunities, right? Which is what, political geniuses do. Reagan was one of them, and Richard Bigelow was one of them, and Irving Kristol was one of them. And you got Reagan.
Yeah. So I remember reading in Nixon Land. I was looking at Nixon Land specifically before about a week or so ago, and it's one of my favorites in the four you've written, because it especially that first half, I think, where you talk about the New Deal created social and economic security in many ways, and kind of like you're saying, these jobs, but then as the middle class kind of ballooned, it creates this kind of consumerism, right? And then it becomes, and it kind of turns.
I tell the story of poor Pat Brown, who literally creates the California middle class. The university system delivers water.
Right.
It's basically California's the fourth biggest economy in the world because of liberalism. And in 1966, he's running against Reagan, and he gives this big Labor Day rally, and it's half full because all these working class people and unions are at their fishing cabins. It's like, and a political scientist who I quote, whose name I forget, even said it in the 1940s. He said basically, the American proletariat, their politics has turned from getting to keeping. Yeah. Pulling up the ladder, making sure we keep the stability that we've earned.
Yeah. And so it does feel like there is this kind of turn that happens, plus all the other things happening in the 60s within society. And so there's this space that kind of gets created of we don't we don't want to have elites or people that are trying to keep all this stuff up here. So then all these other folks that don't have it, it's like, okay. And then you see the conservatives with the rise of Nixon that says this whole idea of the silent majority and all these types of these ways of
this idea that Nixon introduces with the checker speech, which is that it turns out that the liberals are the snobs.
Right.
My wife Pat just wears a respectable Republican cloth coat. That was a reference to, there was a scandal in the Truman administration about one of his aides taking a vicuna, fur coat as a gift, right? But it was all very clever. And then he said, he makes this kind of backhanded reference to Rosemary Kennedy. No one's writing a book about. Oh wait, that's later. I'm confusing my Nixon stuff. But basically, the one of his aides, and this is a very kind of classic formulation by the 1970s among the neocons, says, the liberals are a Toryhood of change. They're Tories, they're the establishment, and they're a particularly dangerous Toryhood because they're kind of shoving all this change down people's throats, and kind of turning their back on this kind of solid supposed middle American silent majority that just kind of works hard, plays by the rules. And Nixon's genius in all this is to speak to their sense of dispossession, that they used to be the moral backbone of society.
Right.
Now the people who are supposedly the moral lights of society are these young people out in the streets protesting. He very specifically says the silent majority are the people who don't protest, right? And also it's also a dog whistle because there's the majority and then there's the minority, and minorities in America are people who are not white. So he's basically saying white people, which I only really figured out like a couple of years ago. It's like he's such a good dog whistler. He's so good at it. Like in his 1968 speech, he says his acceptance speech, which is a classic Law and Order speech. He says the first civil right of all Americans is the right to be safe in their homes. And it never really kind of occurred to me that basically he's saying like, basically it's just this way of denigrating the civil rights movement. It's like those guys say they're for civil rights, but they're not really. We're the real civil rights, activists. It's quite cunning. There's a lot of plausible deniability built into a good dog whistle.
Well, and I think the thing with Nixon is that he was a political genius until it all kind of caught up with him. But I mean, I tell this to a lot of folks a lot of times, we always look at the end of the story with Nixon, but in 68, I mean, everyone would have voted for Nixon. I mean, he kind of had that like
72, everyone did vote for Nixon.
Yeah, right. I mean, there was that whole idea of he's very centrist, he was very politically shrewd. I mean, he was that healthy paranoia that helped him navigate through things. He was Eisenhower's vice president or whatever. I mean, it's just,
although Eisenhower was asked in 1960, right before the election, what Nixon was responsible for in the administration, and he said, "If you give me a week, I'll think of something." So,
right, they didn't really know each other. I think that was purely political because they needed California or whatever. I mean, I think there was like some more political things with Eisenhower there, but
that was a fraught relationship.
Yeah. So I guess the one thing before we move to kind of from Nixon to Reagan real quick is, how do you factor in this kind of suburbanization aspect of pushing politics to the right towards Goldwater, then afterwards? How do you factor that in? Because I feel like that's a big piece here.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Well, I think people much better understand the suburbanization of America was, very much a government project, right? And, it's rooted in this kind of noble New Deal idea that homeownership, is something that's, basically a virtuous circle. If you make it easier to own a home, it's like it used to take, mortgages used to come due in 10 years and you had to have $50% down payment, like completely prohibitive to anyone. Yeah. But, and after the Federal Housing Authority and the New Deal, and certainly the veterans, the Veterans Administration, you didn't need any money to buy a house.
Right.
And, that was obviously a great jobs program. Right. And then, of course, Eisenhower built the interstates. But as we now much better appreciate, this stuff was very explicitly racialized. The FHA literally had lists of groups of people that, were, basically made a home valuable. There was redlining. Yeah. And so the suburbs were white, by design. And, one of the tragedies of history is that just as African Americans really started moving north en masse, basically the answering the call of Uncle Sam to help these war industries, after that you begin to see industrial decline and the hollowing out of central cities and housing crisis that ends up with these housing, high rises that basically are immediately underinvested. So you have these kind of urban donuts where places like Detroit are like losing population, become very crime ridden, surrounded by these extremely prosperous suburbs, which turn out to be factories for manufacturing Republicans, right? There's a little bit of autobiography here too. I asked my parents when I was like an adolescent and I was obsessed with the 60s, I was like, tell me what the 60s was like. Tell me a 60s story. And my parents are a little older. My dad graduated from law school in like 1962, right? So the story my mom told me was that when there was a race riot in Milwaukee in 1967, and there was basically they shut the city down. The mayor shut the city down. No one could go into work. They all owned. My parents owned a business in the inner city of Milwaukee, and their friends had stores and that sort of thing, jewelry stores, pharmacies. So they had a house with a pool that I grew up in, and so they had a pool party. So that was my parents' 60s story. It was literally retreated behind their picket fence, and so they're Republicans, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I grew up knowing that there are certain places in Milwaukee that you roll up your windows. Someone's going to somehow go through the window and snatch you, right? So you have these, and I grew up in a congressional district that elected and reelected James Sensenbrenner, the big Republican, still there. Is he still there? God, he's old.
He's terribly old, if he is still there, but yeah, it's a super. So, I mean, you would see it as it did. There was this kind of way of the suburbanizing of America. As there's definitely racial undertones there for sure, but then also that it was in the political mix of things as well, of this moving from left to right and this kind of swinging of sorts. So that it was all these factions.
People had an investment in property, which tends to make people conservative, right? An investment that was denied to African Americans, right? Yeah. So, and Reagan is like the perfect suburban politician because, one of the things that I write about in Invisible Bridge, which has about like 60 pages of Reagan biography in it, was when he went to work for GE and became the spokesman for GE and became the host of General Electric Theater. They literally built him a house, with all the electrical conveniences. And he would do these 5-minute commercials that were like literally filmed in his house with his family. And he was basically the suburban dad. He was basically like Ward Cleaver. And that was the character he played in this reality show. Kind of Trump had his reality show in which they invented a character for him. Reagan had a character. Yeah. So by 1966, when he's running for governor, this is what people are thinking of. They're not thinking of Bedtime for Bonzo. They're thinking of this suburban dad, who is going to protect them, who's going to protect their suburban houses.
Yeah. What I was going to say is, as we start to see Vietnam ending, Nixon's fall, you see Reagan, the way you tell the introduction of Reagan is really cool because it's very, in the first book, the convention, and then throughout Nixon Land, and then you get to Invisible Bridge.
Yeah, he's always there.
He's always kind of in the background there. Yep. And yeah, that kind of conceptualization of like, he's almost playing a character. Like he's almost playing a role, right? I always see Reagan as like a radical.
Yeah, I mean, it's like even when he's a kid, a lot of ways, he's kind of figured out a role for himself as like one of the things I was quite proud of was the kind of visual analysis I do. It's like I found a picture of him, like 8 years old when he looked really scared, and because he had this terrible chaotic upbringing with this alcoholic father, and he looked like what he was, which was this kid who probably was, just very anxious. And then he kind of discovers superheroes, as it were. He starts reading, kind of children's literature, boys' books, and he kind of transforms himself into his head, into this, this rescuer. And you look at every picture of him from 10 or after, and he seems aware of the camera and seems to be playing this role of this confident, heroic person. Like he would practice being a drum major in front of the mirror with his bedpost, you know?
Yeah. And I think in terms of that whole like movie star to, you know, eventually leader of the free world to the guy that took out all the villains of communism and all, it's just like the story everybody wanted to hear.
Yeah. And it's so interesting. And, you know, sometimes I evolve these ideas that aren't in the books because I'm still thinking about these things. And of course, one of the things I tell in Invisible Bridge is the whole narrative of how we changed from being a New Deal Democrat to a conservative.
Yeah.
And one thing I maybe even hint at a little bit was here's a guy who does not get to fight in World War II and was really invested in the idea of military valor.
Yeah.
You know, he literally cheated on the eye test so he could get into the cavalry, you know, so he could ride horses in 1930s in Iowa. And then when he's like, you know, has this ridiculous job in the military because the studio doesn't want to see him overseas, you know, basically making training films. And he doesn't even get to star in the training films, by the way. But people are complaining he's marching them around like he's like freaking, you know, General George C. You know, he sees George C. Scott and Patton, you know. And I appreciate more that like fighting the idea that the idea he had in his head that he was fighting communism in Hollywood, fighting the takeover of communists of Hollywood, which was total bullshit. Yeah. But a lot of people still believe it.
This was the SAG thing, right? Where he was
the SAG thing, right?
Yeah.
He's literally like, you know, basically figuring out a way to turn what he's doing, which is basically breaking a union and letting his fellow union members cross a picket line during a strike. He's turning that into this heroic act of fighting communism. Right. And what's really striking is, you know, by the time of the implosion of McCarthy, which is pretty much when Reagan makes the change, the Democrats don't buy this narrative anymore that they're fighting communism at home, that internal communist subversion is this existential problem for America. And that leaves him without a party in the Democratic Party. You know, he's completely stripped of his heroic role, and his idea of himself as a hero is so important to himself. And that's when he begins to, you know, embrace Eisenhower and then Nixon. You know, he has this famous letter he writes to Nixon in which he says, this guy Kennedy under the tousled hair is still the same old Karl Marx. You know, this idea that like the Reds, you know, are they ready? You know, he's ready. He's, you know, Wolverines, you know, he's fighting them, you know?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think, and then kind of the last two points I have here is about in Reagan Land, right? You know, which is, came out in August last year, right? Didn't it come out in August?
Yeah. Paperback in August.
That's right. You know, it's really this kind of, it feels like the conservatives realized or learned as things were shifting in the late 60s, early 70s that, okay, we do culture war stuff. That's how we have to pivot to that kind of
policy stuff with Goldwater just didn't work.
Right.
These all came out of the Goldwater campaign, all suffered the sting of loss behind this guy who's like, let's sell the TVA, let's end Social Security, you know, let's end farm supports, you know. People aren't buying that.
No.
And if you look at the actual exit polls, people still aren't buying that when they vote for Reagan.
Right. That's right. So then they kind of do this branding behind this kind of literally this movie star that's very heroic, and you know, it's a story people want to buy, and it kind of leads to this kind of Reaganomics of sorts on this notion of family values and war on drugs and all these like kind of social cultural kinds of wars. And so maybe just talk about like how that again, you had the party of you know, Eisenhower, and then, you know, it shifts now to 1980 or, you know, late 70s, 80s of Reagan.
Yeah. And Reagan, you know, still buys all the policy stuff. He never, you know, wavers from that, but he's also, you know, yes, selling an image of, you know, making America great again, to coin a phrase, right? But the part of the coalition behind him, part is big business, and I tell that story, right? How big business turns away from kind of accepting the New Deal and accepting labor. But the other big branch of the coalition is these people who kind of come out of the Nixon fiasco and are kind of desperate to kind of recover conservatism, and begin to grasp that the way to do it is just to look for things about the mainstreaming of the 60s social movements, feminism, gay rights, and the rest, and look for places, local places, really, busing, where these places are causing consternation, and fan them.
Yeah.
Right. They're organizing discontent. They're actively looking for the most divisive possible issues. And often they're not even necessarily all that political, right? They're about culture. They're about what is the definition of a family, right? And then they kind of hit the mother lode, and it's quite explicit, quite deliberate on the part of the new right leader, Richard Viguerie, that, you know, basically the left has unions, these ready-made organizations that kind of send people into battle in a politically disciplined way. But what about all these churches? Right? We can convert these pastors to politics, and there's this strange turn that American fundamentalism takes, in which it really kind of retreats away from kind of active political engagement. There's this kind of biblical injunction that, you know, as Jerry Falwell puts it in 1965, preachers are not called to be politicians, they're called to be soul winners. And they find the most influential fundamentalist preachers who have TV shows, and they're like, look, you guys need to send your flocks out to the polls. You know, you need to start acting like you're precinct leaders, or else the gays are going to take over, and the feminists are going to take over. And, you know, for a lot of these people, these are literally satanic forces.
Right.
And once you got that, and once you have them lined up behind Reagan, not Reagan first, but eventually Reagan, you know, you have suddenly a machine, right? You have your own right-wing political machine. And that story is just fascinating.
It's what Goldwater, I think, kind of envisioned, probably, right? That was the building that coalition of sorts kind of played out all the way.
Yeah, but like Goldwater, you know, he was a very distinct personality in that he was this kind of reluctant politician in a lot of ways. He didn't want to be president.
True.
You know, he was very much about telling the truth as he saw it and not trimming it all. You know, when Nathan tell him, say, talk about this instead of that, he's like, bullshit, I'm going to talk about what I want to talk about. So he's this really ornery guy. And ironically enough, partially because of the internal politics of the Arizona Republican Party, he's, by the 1980s, he's enraged at the Christian right, who kind of offend his libertarian sensibilities, but also just they're jerks in Arizona. A lot of personalities involved. But like, so the difference between Goldwater and Reagan is, you know, Reagan is kind of willing to play a role and willing. One of the things I really emphasized once I get to the actual Reagan campaign in 1980 was how sophisticated and well planned it was. You know, I really try and elevate the role of a guy named Richard Worthland, who was this pollster who came up with this like 150-page campaign plan that was unbelievably sophisticated. You know, did things like tracking polls, focus groups. They would research which speech lines got the best response. You know, and Goldwater wouldn't do any of that stuff. You know, that's one of the differences. But you know, another big part of the difference was Goldwater wanted to educate people about why liberal policy was bad. You know, Reagan wanted to govern the country.
Yeah, and I think the one last piece on this, and I have a more current question, is so. I mean, and you might know a little bit more about this. Everyone talks about in Michigan, I think in Wisconsin, the Reagan Democrats, right? These Democrats that went to Reagan, and how there was this kind of this voting block of like socially conservative, northern whites, intellectuals, minorities.
Anti-war.
Putting all of that in one coalition or voting block, how did that kind of morph and shape right there?
Well, the Reagan Democrats are an interesting phenomenon because it really goes back to the roots of Reagan's conservative politics, right? So he goes to work for GE. And the guy who hires him is this guy named Lemuel Boulware, who I write about in Invisible Bridge. And he was kind of one of the most important American political figures you've never heard of. He was the guy who really figured out, again, using focus groups, you know, in the 1950s, how to wedge working class people from their union leaders and make them feel more loyalty to capitalism, conservative values, the company. And he was the guy who hired Reagan, right? And he taught Reagan conservative politics. And he would literally do like focus groups with GE workers and figure out what messages work best with them. He would just do things like distribute, a comic book version of the libertarian book, The Road to Serfdom. So, really, he taught Reagan to speak to union members. I mean, this is a guy who will go to factory, and a guy who had this emotional intelligence to really know how to kind of trim his presentation to get the most audience response. So he was someone who was brilliant at talking to working class people. He always had that ace in the hole that he had been a union leader and a union member, right? He would pull out his union card, even though SAG was really, when he was the head of a company union, it really kind of served the interest of the bosses as much as the workers. Right. And then there were all these factors, the fact that, the Democratic Party had, become the party of people who were skeptical of war and skeptical of the military and skeptical of traditional patriotism, and had gone all in with African Americans as a core constituency, which was seen as kind of a zero-sum thing. And this is the era of affirmative action, which was kind of conceived in an era, again, of post-scarcity. But the pie is shrinking. So, when you give someone a job, you feel like you're taking away someone else's job. So all these things kind of come together, and again, an opportunity that brilliant political activists seize, right? It just doesn't happen by itself, right? Part of the campaign plan was to reach out to blue collar workers. And one of the things Richard Wirthlin says in one of his studies is they score high on authoritarianism. And with Wirthlin is the guy who, everyone knows that Reagan, kind of starts his campaign in Neshoba, Mississippi, right? Saying states' rights. I think in a lot of ways that's a little unfair. People overemphasize that because his next stop was at the Urban League in New York. But when he started his primary campaign, he started it in Cicero, Chicago, Cicero, Illinois, which is like the most racist place in America. He starts it in South Boston. He starts it in Milwaukee, which is my hometown, which was a very segregated place. He starts it in Atlanta. So, they're reaching out to these white working class voters, on, basically implicitly racial terms.
So last question, because I want to be respectful of your time, is, in some ways, so we have 40 years of, since Reagan gets elected in 80, and we've had 8 years of Bush Jr., 4 years, of Bush Sr., 8 years of Bush Jr., and then 4 years of Trump.
Bush Sr. was my favorite character to write about.
Yeah, Bush Sr. is fascinating. I do feel he is a moderate. So, but interesting. Yeah, we're now post-Trump, and it just feels like the conservative Republican Party is so different in some ways from 1980, and so it really feels like there's this turning point now of. Does the Republican Party kind of go back to like the kind of old school conservative Bush and or McCain Romney kind of way, or do they latch onto this kind of right wing populism that Trump kind of was entertaining? And what are your thoughts just from that period?
That ship has sailed. I mean, they've already kind of made their bets, right? But what is the big difference, right? And I've obviously had a lot of opportunities to think about that and talk about it. And I think the most profound difference between kind of the conservatism in the Reagan vein and the conservatism in the Trump vein is that conservatism was always kind of a Janus-based situation. It faced two different directions. The one was, a populist rap, kind of seeking out division, seeking out anger, using demagogic tactics to kind of reach what was kind of lowest in the kind of like the consciousness of the voter. Nasty, right? Yeah. But it always had that other face that kind of faced out to, the mainstream media, maybe, the moderates who lived in suburbs who believed in a politics of respectability. And so the idea of kind of walking that tightrope was the most essential skill a Republican politician had. Reagan was great at it. Even Nixon was great at it.
Sure.
Even McCain was great at it. He has his commercial, build the dang fence, right?
Right.
And, this is some really good examples, when Mitt Romney, son of one of the great liberal Republicans, George Romney, says, no one ever asked to see my birth certificate, right? So he's kind of like looking in the populist direction, but in a kind of very dog whistle kind of way. Or George W. Bush appreciating that, he's basically going to use the anger that Americans feel at kind of Arabs right after 9/11 to launch this war he wants in Iraq, but he's also going to simultaneously say Islam is a religion of peace. Right. Again, this very narrow tightrope. And what Trump does is once he comes down that escalator, and says, Mexico is sending the rapists, and by the way, some of them are from the Middle East too. He just completely introduces this completely new permission structure into Republican politics, which it's not just him. People flock to it, Lindsey Graham flocks to it, right? And it's basically, it's the end of the dog whistle. It's the idea that we're going to completely ring the curtain down on this idea that we have to kind of maintain this respectable front, right? And they're just willing to kind of jack, unadulteratedly into, the lizard brain of the electorate without this kind of high-minded policy discourse. And that's a shift. But you've got to understand that, one is not possible without the other. One feeds into the other, right? And, that's one of the things I kind of hope to demonstrate in Reagan Land is that no one who reads it should be surprised at how kind of vicious and venal the evangelical, right was, and always has been, right? I mean, these are the folks who are literally, stoking eliminationist violent rage against gays and lesbians, right? That's what they're doing, right? That's what Jerry Falwell was about, So, it shouldn't be particularly shocking, that these guys turn out to be, pretty ugly and embrace a guy like Trump. Right?
But does it mean that their economic messaging or some of their other policy things are not, they don't really believe it, or they're just saying that's what they have to, limited government and, tax cuts? And
there was a lot of fear, right? I mean, there was a lot of fear that when there's a lot of fear among Democrats that Trump was going to abandon, the kind of libertarian economics of the Republican Party, which has never been particularly popular, and do things like, do infrastructure, back away from kind of tax cuts. But of course, he went, all in on that and never, made a gesture towards infrastructure. So for various, kind of complicated reasons, the policy agenda, such as it is, is pretty consistent. It's, deconstruct the regulatory state or whatever the hell was Steve Bannon's thing, tax cuts, which is the one bill he actually passed, right? Put his muscle behind. And, all these, kind of anti-democracy moves to try and, kind of disempower Democratic constituencies at the expense of, Republican constituencies. Yeah. So, policy-wise, we might have expected a shift, but it never really happened.
So the last question I have is then, where do you think conservatism and the Conservative Party goes in the future, the next 5 to 10 years? And will you write more books about conservatism?
Well, I think I'm going to collect some of my journalism, so there'll be plenty of conservatism in there. I think I'm going to move on to other subjects, but I have that historian's discomfort. Anyone who says they know what's going to happen next, it's like, I like to say, no one would have predicted that the guy who would save the Republican Party, in the late 70s, when people were talking about it going the way of the Whigs, was the one guy who didn't think Nixon did anything wrong at Watergate, which was, wrong.
Right. Yeah.
So I think that, it's a minority coalition. They've given up on, basically coming up with 50% of the vote. And that's a pretty dark place to be in a democracy. So I think we'll see more of that. And frankly, more eliminationist rage towards, liberals. Alas.
Goodness, that's dark.
But we shall overcome.
Yeah, that's right.
It's like they had a real hard time, kind of turning Uncle Joe into Chairman Mao. So, I think that my unmelodramatic conclusion is we'll probably see a situation like in the 60s and the 70s when the Republican Party was, limping along as a opposition party.
Yeah. Well, history does repeat itself. So, Rick, I can't say enough. It's been so nice. I've enjoyed every second. It's really awesome to read your books and then be able to talk to you about all these awesome themes. And where can people find you and online and anywhere else?
I have a website, rickperlstein.net. I don't really update it. I tweet at Rick Perlstein.
Okay. Well, you're always welcome to come on anytime you want to talk about anything. And
thanks for the interview.
Hopefully we can talk in the future.
Cheers.